Hi guys, so this is the last weekly prelim review that I'll be preparing for you. So by this time you should already have sufficient practice, so this will really be one last test of your competencies before you go for A-level. So this is RI 2021. I'll go through CSQ1 first. In both CSQs, the data questions are fairly easy. I would just say the only unconventional thing about this, the only unconventional thing about this question is there is 3 marks. So just make sure that you're able to make 3 observations, general and specific observations about the changes in the market. For B, with the help of a diagram, use supply and demand analysis to explain how the COVID-19 pandemic has been responsible for the changes in the market for bicycles in countries like the USA. So they want you to use a diagram. Which diagram do you use? Supply and demand. Okay. The trigger is the pandemic, so you must use the case material. Don't just use your own knowledge. Responsible for changes in the market. So recap, in demand supply, what does market refer to? Market refers to equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So it's basically a 10-step question. So I'll go through the 10 steps. So diagram is 1 mark. Just check your axis P and Q and your demand and supply, they shift in the correct direction. Then you'll get 1 mark. Step 1, explain that there's an increase in interest in cycling. Taste and preference have changed, so increased demand for cycling. They didn't do this. Okay, so because here it's only just 6 marks and they only want to explain the directional change in P and Q, there's nothing to suggest that there was a sharp increase or limited increase in P or Q, so we'll just do direction. So you don't need PED and PES. So step 2, skip. Step 3 is about revenue and expenditure, skip. Step 4, supply fall because of supply disruptions. The extract told you about all these shutdowns in East Asian factories, so that increased the cost of production because there are fewer factories producing these parts to make the bicycles. 5 is PED, you skip because I don't need the extent of change in P and Q. Step 6 you skip, question is not about revenue. Step 7, so please, they actually have it here, 7 is here, but I think you should do it on top. So 7, you weigh the change of demand against supply. So whether demand changed more, supply changed more. Doesn't matter which one you go for. Just give me a reason why one changed more than the other. Step 8, diagram. Step 9, price adjustment process. Then step 10, you answer, you tell me what happens to P and Q based on whether demand changed more or supply changed more. Okay, so this is a typical 10-step question. Nothing difficult about this. C, with reference to extract 2, so you must use evidence. Explain the link, explain, don't need 2 sides, the link between PES and increased lead times experienced by bicycle companies. So they're saying that bicycle companies have to wait longer to get their bicycles after placing the order. So this one I found I would have given 1 mark for the definition of PES. So I think it's important to have defined it. So how do you explain this? You need to link to the PES factors. And what are the PES factors? Then things like whether the producer has spare capacity to produce any more. So here they explain there was a rising demand for bicycles. So bicycle companies are already producing at full capacity. So it's very hard for them to churn out more bicycles because whichever factories are open, they're already running to the maximum capacity. So difficult to obtain bicycle parts. With less spare capacity, companies are less able to respond quickly to the increase in prices. So this tool is basically to explain the lack of spare capacity. So it's very hard for companies to increase their production. The last part here is to link to PES. So it means that the PES is less than 1. What does it mean? It means that a rise in price will bring about a less than proportionate, key part, less than proportionate increase in quantity supply. So that's what PES less than 1 means. So the last part is important to link to PES less than 1. Rise in prices. Why is there a rise in price? this was in the previous question, or simply rise in demand would have increased the price. So this causes price to go up, but then there's a less than proportionate increase in quantity supplied because of PES less than 1. This also works. D, using a PPC, explain how the investment by Shimano in Osaka and Yamaguchi will impact Japan's economy. So question is, will impact Japan's economy. So this is macro. Because it's macro, your PPC diagram, the axis will be capital goods and consumer goods. So we are doing a macro analysis using PPC. So 1 mark for diagram. Second mark, you use the case to tell me what is the investment by Shimano and Yamaguchi. They are trying to build more cutting-edge manufacturing equipment and software, expand existing facilities. This yellow part I highlighted will be the one I think you are going to miss out. So they're spending more on manufacturing equipment. This is capital goods. So if you look at the PPC, let's say initially economy was at PPC 0. Economy was producing here. As they spend more on manufacturing equipment, it's a movement along the PPC. So they're producing more capital goods. They probably have to give up some consumer goods. So this is the point I think you forget. And I think we haven't assessed this enough. We always talk about shifting of PPC, moving of the point towards the PPC or away, but we rarely talk about moving along the curve. So I thought this was quite a good question. And I think if any of you have this, please let me know. I'll be very impressed. I probably would have missed this out myself. So because in this particular context, it's very clear that they're spending more on capital goods, and that's why there's a movement along the PPC away from consumer goods and towards capital goods. Then the last one, I think you will be able to give me this. Investing more on capital goods, these will increase productive capacity. PPC will shift out. So this is actually potential growth. I think it would be good if you can link to potential growth here. Okay, E, protecting subways against flooding caused by extreme weather is an enormous undertaking, but the cost of doing nothing is more expensive. Discuss the factors the government must consider before spending more on subways. So this is a discuss the factor question. It's a DMF question. I kept the answer as it is. They gave mainly just bullet points, not very difficult. You just use the C3IP to do the DMF, a factor-based approach. So here I would say minimum 2 factors, try and go for 3. These factors here are to explain benefits. So based on these benefits, government should spend more on subways. Then this one is actually costs. This one is a combination of constraint and unintended consequence and whatnot. So I kind of put in the headers for you. Write them in separate paragraphs. So at least 2 to 3 factors. So explain how these factors will affect the decision to spend more on subways. Then in the conclusion, you weigh the factors. I kept the RI one here. So they're going for more like a tentative kind of stand, not very clear. I prefer doing a clearer upplay, downplay. So let's say I go for benefits. Benefits is the most important factor. Then I play up benefits. Because if we look at the benefits of building subway, the benefits span both macro and micro goals. So they are very significant. Plus, in terms of time, they will be experienced for a very long time. But if we talk about the costs, constraints, consequences, unintended consequence of building subway, like the high cost, the environmental impact when you build subways, all these are just short term, right? After the subway is built, you don't have any more of this negative externality. And the cost is incurred in the short term. After you build and you pay off, the benefits will still be there. So the benefits will outlast the cost. So that's my update downplay. I think this is easier to come up with and it's clearer. So consider which one works better for you. F, identify and explain 2 main characteristics of public good. So this is easier. We have tested this to death already. So you should be able to explain non-rivalry and non-excludability. Comment briefly on whether cycling paths exhibit these characteristics. So cycling paths is a bit, you could say that it's excludable or not excludable, right? There are private bicycle parks, probably not in Singapore, but overseas. But you could either or, it's up to you to argue. So it's not clear. Okay, so here they argue that actually cycling paths are not excludable. So you can go for that, right? If you build a cycling path, it's very hard to exclude anyone. That's fine. But then definitely it is rivalrous because there's limited capacity. When more people use the cycling path, fewer other people can use the cycling path. So I would say when you apply to cycling path context, yeah, it's important to say that it is rivalrous. Okay. G. Discuss the view that government's decision to subsidize green vehicles is the best policy. So discuss, you must have balance. This is the policy, subsidies for green vehicles. Best. This one means that you must compare. Okay. And the problem is negative externality. So it's very clear. But the question before all this did not ask you to explain negative externality. And I think some of you have the tendency to spend a lot of time here explaining the causes of negative externality. But the key focus of this question is policy comparison. So you shouldn't be going in depth into the problem. I would just say you do in the intro. So here I kind of put in all these headers. So whatever's printed, okay, no, it wasn't printed for you. So I put in the headers here so it's easier to refer to the answer. You just diagnose the economic problem. Tell me that there's negative externality, maybe just what are the negative externalities. But don't need to go through the 7 steps and explain the problem. Go straight into the policy. So once I've diagnosed the problem, I go straight to policy. Because it's policy comparison, it's better to do policy-based approach. I start with the given policy, subsidy. Here's the mechanism. So you should know the 4 elements of subsidy. This is the RI answer, so it may miss out some of the elements I asked you to include. Then pros, I included this for you. I basically just use feast. Then these are the cons. So this version of the document is in the Team Direct Google Drive. You can download it. So it's edited. This answer is edited. It's not the one that is uploaded for the department. I just went through quickly to edit this for you. So these are the standard pros and cons of subsidies. And then tax on fuel power vehicles could be the alternative policy. So you reduce consumption of fuel vehicles, get them to switch over to green vehicles. So this one you can explain tax, but most importantly, you must link back to market for green vehicles. Okay, don't just tell me reduce consumption of fuel power vehicles. Link back to market for green vehicles and tell me that it will increase consumption there. Increase consumption to QS. Pros and cons. It's basically a standard feast. There are some other alternative policies you can include. This is from RI. You either talk about R&D. So if you want to just stay within the green vehicle market, it could be R&D. How to even reduce the amount of electricity they use in green vehicles. I wouldn't use this because this is not the correct market. This is the fuel vehicle market, but we are not talking about the green vehicle market. Cleaner energy to power electric vehicles. Rules to let actually this one also okay. Actually, I tell you what, just forget the alternative policy. Just use these two. You know why? Because the problem here is sorry. Okay, sorry, scratch that. The problem here is the problem here is negative externality. And the key market, the primary market that we are talking about, is the market for fuel vehicles. Okay, now understand. So this is the key market we're talking about. Okay, this is the key market we're talking about. So when we talk about subsidies for green vehicle, right, you must link back to the primary market. And the primary market is the fuel vehicle market. So as you subsidize green vehicles and consumption of green vehicles go up, it will reduce the consumption of fuel vehicles to QS. Okay, So the second policy, tax on fuel vehicles, don't need to link back already. This is the primary market you're talking about. Okay, sorry about that. So this is correct. Okay. Your alternative policy, these are okay. Okay, so if you want to stick to the, or you cannot stick to the fuel vehicle market because the given policy to you is already subsidies of green vehicle. But if you want to do a third policy, can R&D to reduce emissions of fuel vehicles. So if you do this one, it's basically reducing the NEC of fuel vehicles. This will reduce the MSC and increase QS closer to QF. We have done this before. Or use regulation so that cars use catalytic converters to reduce emission, but it's the same mechanism. Okay, then the limitations are here. You add in the pros yourself. This is the RI conclusion. They go for very tentative one. Depends on this, depends on this, depends on this. I don't like that. I prefer a clearer stand. So let's say I go for this. Subsidies on green vehicles are more effective. Then I do my upplay, downplay. I downplay the tax on fuel vehicles. Fuel vehicles, we have been taxed for the longest time, but they are still overconsumed, right? Because the tax has only gotten people to switch to taking public transport. The people who are still willing to pay the tax and driving are people who will never give up driving, because probably the PV is less than 1. To them, driving is a necessity and there are no substitutes. So this tax will not work because even if they have to pay more, they'll pay more. PD is less than 1. QD will fall less than proportionally. What will help them switch is you help them move over to green vehicles. Subsidize green vehicles so that you reduce the cost of transition because they cannot give up driving. So that's how I argue subsidies for green vehicle is more effective. Okay, so that's the upplay, downplay. So that's CSQ1. CSQ2 data question is very easy. I won't go through. So from A part 1 and A part 2, you can see that these two are linked. So from A part 1, you know that oil prices have fallen. Second question, A part 2, they ask you, explain how the balance of trade. So balance of trade refers to export revenue minus import expenditure. How this is affected by the above trend. We've done questions like this before. Goods like crude oil, aluminum, steel, rubber, all these are commodities. They have PV less than 1, okay, because they are essential, they are necessities, fuel substitutes. So I just summarize all this. Fall in price of crude oil will reduce their price of export because this is their key export. Okay, almost all the exports come from this sector. And since PD is less than 1, quantity demand that goes up less than proportionately because PD is less than 1. And therefore the total revenue will fall. So it will reduce their export revenue. But linked to BOT, for an export revenue, this will increase a trade deficit. If there were a trade deficit, ceteris paribus, whole import constant. So this is the answer. You can use this or use my links here. Same. A part 2, using ADAS, explain how the trend in oil prices is likely to affect the inflation rate of an oil importing country. So the previous question was on oil exporter. Now we talk about oil importer. Okay, so fall in price of oil, crude oil, this will reduce the price of FOP because it's a key FOP for many industries. So this will reduce COP, increase SRAS, reduce GPL. So it's likely to reduce inflation, or you can just say it can cause deflation because they want you to link to inflation rate. You must use diagram. So you move the AS curve downwards and then you show the falling prices. B part 1, account for the difference in labor force participation rate between Saudi Arabia and Singapore. This is not really an econs question. It's more of you look at the data, can you make an inference? So if you look at the labor force participation rate, you can see that Singapore females participate in labor force at a higher rate. That could explain the difference in labor force participation rate. Okay, so you use evidence and justify this. There are also evidence here that in Saudi Arabia there's this gender segregation, strict laws. against males and females working together, and that may have affected the labor force participation rate of females. So I'll just let you read the answer here. B part 2, explain the link between productivity and long-term growth. So this should be easy. This is just theory. Long-term growth is basically potential growth. And you know productivity can affect LRAS and SRAS. So you can make the links here. Comment on whether increase in female labor force participation rate can solve the stagnant productivity and weak long-term growth problem in Saudi Arabia. So there are two parts. First, you explain. This explanation is quite simple. We've done this so many times. Diagram is easy. Refer to yourself. This is part of the answer. Oh, wait, sorry. No, this is part of the comment already. So the comment is on whether women entering the labor force will solve stagnant productivity and weak long-term growth. So here they link female participation rate to growth. So you link this to economic growth, preferably potential growth, because it's long-term. So increased AS is long-term. Then the second portion, you must talk about whether it will solve the productivity problem. Okay, so take note when you dissect the question, be very careful. Here they want to talk about whether increased female labor force participation can solve two problems. Okay, because there's a word N. Stagnant productivity and long-term growth. Long-term growth, you must use ADAS, but AS lah, because it's long-term growth. So there are two things you want to talk about in your comment. So as I said, this portion here is on potential growth, and this portion here is on productivity. So when you look at your answer, just check whether you had addressed two things. A lot of times I realize when the question lumps two things together, something and something, students tend to just deal with both at the same time. C, to what extent do the data allow you to conclude that SG has a higher SOL than Saudi Arabia? This is very easy, so I won't go through. I just want to point out some things. They give you two GDP figures here. Which one should you use? You should be using this, not this. Why? Because you are comparing over space, Singapore versus Saudi Arabia. In that case, you should be using PPP, because PPP accounts for cost of living, right? So you shouldn't be using the constant USD, you should be using PPP. And that's what they use first. Okay, explain how GDP can be linked to can be linked to SOL. But take note, this is the part I realized both H1 and H2 students tend to miss. When they give you GDP, PPP data and you use it, point out that this PPP is useful for comparing over space because it accounts for the relative cost of living in respective countries. So this part is the one I think a lot of people forget. The rest is quite simple. You take the macro data and you link to SOL. Is there anything that you might confuse? Okay, if let's say they gave you things like inflation rate, GDP growth rate, you know all these are wrong, you don't use it because you're comparing over space. So sometimes they give you these things to confuse you, you don't use. These are for comparing over time. When you're comparing over space like this, there is no change. There's no change, okay? Antithesis, you can point out what's missing in the data set, and then you do your synthesis. So this is the RI one. Again, I prefer something very clear. So this is my take on the evaluation. I say that Singapore has higher overall SOL. Why? Because Singapore has higher national income. And higher national income is very important. Even after accounting for population size, it's per capita, and accounting for cost of living using PPP. Plus, Singapore got lower unemployment. Our macro performance is very strong. And that means that Singapore generally has greater ability to improve overall SOL. Plus, there's lower corruption problems, greater equality. So corruption usually worsens inequity because the corrupted will benefit at the expense of the rest. So in general, because of better gender equality, lower corruption, there's a greater sense of equity, this sense of fairness and justice. So there's higher non-mature SOL. For Saudi Arabia, in the body, you could have explained that, oh, the state pays for all these things, healthcare, education, etc. So they have higher non-material SOL. But there is not enough data on outcomes. Even if government there spend more, the outcome may not be very high, may not be very strong, right? So Singapore may actually even have high outcomes. Better outcomes because our systems are generally very strong. So there's not enough data to say that just because Saudi Arabia spends more on healthcare and education, then they have higher non-material SOL. So I downplay Saudi as well here. Okay, so I hope this is useful. As you finish the multiplier program with me, this builds on what we have kind of practiced in multiplier, and then you get more samples of how to do this upplay and downplay. D, explain how expansionary fiscal budget can help stimulate Singapore economy, and comment on the difficulties the government is likely to face in ensuring the most desirable outcome. So just the first part, explain how basically expansionary fiscal policy can help to achieve macro goals. Okay, that stimulate the Singapore economy. Second part, comment on the difficulties in using this policy. So comment on the difficulties. You need to first tell me, you need to first explain the difficulties. Okay, actually that you only have time to just list out the difficulties. I would say it would be best if you can give me the difficulties and then compare which one is most significant. But the comment portion here is at most three marks. So you can't do so much. So probably you can just list out the difficulties. So this portion here is just mechanism of fiscal policy, nothing out of the blue. So all these are just mechanism, easy. Take note, this stimulate economic growth is not just growth. You must have go for scope. Don't just link to actual growth. So you can see over here they have growth, right? GDP goes up, and then they also link to reducing cyclical unemployment. Okay, so go for more than one macro goal. Then these are the difficulties. Basically, these are the limitations of fiscal policy. But take note, you must use extract evidence, which is over here. You can read yourself. If you have no evidence, you are maxed out at 6. If you're not linked to case material. Okay, so you can pause here if you want. You can pause here if you want. Okay. E, last one, discuss the challenges Saudi Arabia and Singapore are likely to face in trying to achieve inclusive and sustainable growth. So here there are 4 things. You have income equality, you have sustainability, you have actual growth, and you have potential growth. So there are 4 things. So it's quite a long, you have to be very careful not to overwrite. And the question is about challenges, it's not about policy. Okay, challenges. So first here they talk about challenges in terms of sustained growth. In terms of actual and potential growth, what are the challenges the countries face? You must use case material here. Okay, and this part, in trying to achieve, so this is policy. So in trying to use policy to achieve these 4 things, what are the challenges this country face? So you just identify the policy, but don't need to go into detail how the policy works. Focus on limitation. Okay, focus on challenges. So first they talk about sustained growth, actual potential growth. What are some challenges both countries face? Then sustainability. What are the challenges both countries face? Then inclusivity. What challenges do both countries face? So they structure based on the goals. You might want to consider that. Some of you may do country. So Singapore face this, Saudi Arabia face this. But you might end up repeating because some of the challenges may be the same. So if you structure by challenge, then within the challenge you talk about both countries, it might be easier. Then at the end, I find the conclusion quite weak. So everything here, I wouldn't bother looking at it. I don't know why this one is so... Their answer is generally okay, but this part here, I thought, can't make head or tail of it. So I tried to work it out here for you. We have already explained all the different challenges for the different goals in the body. So at the end, I put the question here so you can see clearly. At the end, you need to compare the challenges. And I think it's easier if you split by country. So you do Singapore, then you do Saudi Arabia. So for Singapore, I just BS on. I say that sustainability is the most significant challenge. So to do this, I must play up sustainability challenge in Singapore, and I downplay the other challenges in Singapore. So for instance, because Singapore is so small, there's just no renewable energy option. Even solar is very limited. So basically, Singapore government is quite helpless when it comes to sustainability. But when you talk about other challenges like actual growth, potential growth, inclusivity, there are actually policies that can be used. So those challenges are not so significant because we are less helpless for those challenges. For Saudi Arabia, I argue that let's say sustained growth is the most important challenge or significant one. Then I need to play up sustained growth challenge and I need to downplay other challenges. How do I do that? I say that, well, Saudi Arabia has to overcome so many years of lack of technology advancement because they just keep using oil, right? They don't develop high-tech industries, and women are only starting to work recently. They may lack a lot of skills. So to pursue growth, they lack all this FOP technology. It's very hard to grow. While for other aspects like sustainability, inclusivity, they make so much money from oil, they can probably use that money to promote these other goals. But for the FOP challenge thing, right, all this is not just about money, it's about time. Even if you have money, you need time to innovate, you need time to build up skills. So that's how I do my upplay downplay. So I hope this was useful for you. That brings me to the end of this review. It's the last, hopefully, actually I think so, it's the last recording I'll probably make this year. So I hope this has all been very helpful for you. I actually hope more than a handful of you actually reached this point. And if you have, then I thank you and all the best.